Everybody, thanks so much for listening to the podcast. If you're listening to us for the first time, please like, subscribe, definitely share this interview. We have Daniel Levin on, DanielLevinAuthor.com. He is a man that knows a lot about foreign policy, and we are getting Daniel on because of the invasion that started last night. The Russians are moving to Kyiv over in the Ukraine. Daniel, thanks so much for coming on and speaking on such short notice. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Rob. It's my pleasure.
So we talked about this a little bit in a previous interview, but can you give a short history on this conflict with Ukraine and Russia?
I mean, really want a history, you kind of have to go back to the last century and the years of the Soviet Union. Obviously, Ukraine, like many countries in Eastern Europe, were part of the first of all, Warsaw Pact, and then obviously Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. What then later, after the collapse in the late 80s, early 90s, became Russia again. And so there were a few countries that Russians still consider sort of part of Greater Russia, like White Russia or Belarus, and the Ukraine in particular. But the ties with Ukraine are a little more complicated. And just a quick parenthesis, in the middle of the last century, in particular during the Second World War, a lot of the top Soviet generals were Armenian, actually. Then, as the last century progressed, especially 70s and 80s, a lot of senior generals and politicians in the Soviet Union, meaning pre-breakup of the Soviet Union, were Ukrainian. And there are a lot of Russian officials today whom I know and people I've worked with closely. Some I write about in the last book, Nothing But a Circus. Those are Russian officials, senior people who are actually born in the Ukraine, in Odessa and Kiev and other parts of the country. So I think that the affinity or the connection that Russia feels for the Ukraine is not entirely imaginary, and it's not entirely invented by Putin to justify this war. Doesn't justify this war, but I do believe that there is kind of an affinity to this conflict. Russia has been eyeing the Ukraine for a long time, but some of the context you and I have discussed briefly in the past was also that when the Soviet Union collapsed and you had the turbulent years in the 90s in Russia, and you had the Yeltsin years, and you had a lot of crime, a lot of gangs, and then Putin comes to power in the late 90s, early 2000s, and basically he's the law and order guy. He's the former KGB guy who comes to clean up, and we're talking early Putin here in the first two terms. And he really does clean up, but the one thing he always laments from the very beginning is Soviet Union collapse. That was the biggest calamity in the 20th century as far as he's concerned. And the West, in particular, the US, keeps shoving that in their face. And one way that they're shoving it in their face is by expanding NATO to Eastern Europe and to the Russian borders. And for him, the Ukraine always was the kind of symbol, which is you're going to move NATO troops to our border in the Ukraine, which we consider as motherland Russia. That's going to be an act of war. That was always something he said in 2000, 2001 in meetings with US officials, something he still says today. So that's a little bit of an emotional context. It goes a lot deeper with the Ukraine and their social aspects, but that's the quick answer to your question.
Do you think, because it seems like when President Trump, and I'm not sticking up for President Trump, was not a fan of him, not a fan of Biden personally either, but it seems like Putin and Trump played nice. Do you think that Russia and Putin in general was waiting until this time where the US is suffering from a pandemic, a weak economy, inflation, political uncertainty, because there's all this infighting about the vaccines, the right and the left, and then Putin saw that this is the time to strike? Do you feel like that's why he struck against Biden? He thought he was a weak leader and all these other things were in flux?
No, I don't think so. I think Putin in his core knows that actually the weakest leader the US has had in centuries is actually Trump. Yeah. Just because he doesn't act in the US national interest. And in fact, Trump's statements on Fox and Tucker Carlson's statements are just shameful. And I'm not even going to dignify that further. If we can't even agree on the fact that that's shameful, that you're siding with a dictator who's massacring another people, where we claim to stand for freedom, irrespective of your politics, and you're going to side with a guy like Putin because you think he's so clever and how he did this, then that's so shameful. The idea that that comes from a former US president or an influential news host such as Tucker Carlson, I'm just not going to dignify that further. And anyone, it's not a political statement of mine. There are a lot of, fair-minded Republicans who view this the same way. And I hope that people like Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio, who've stood on the right side of Russia, meaning on the right side of this conflict, I mean, are going to come out strongly. But let's not waste our time with Trump and that, because I really, that's a red herring. I think that this invasion of Ukraine is actually not about Biden. It's not about the US. And if to the extent it's about Europe, it's pretty complicated. I think at the core, if you really want to understand why Putin did this, if you're looking at Trump, if you're looking at Germany and France, you're looking, in my opinion, in the wrong place. Let me get some context. Putin has been selling to his own fellow Russians that the Ukraine is Russia, that they're the same ethnicity, that they're the same Slavs, same membership in the Russian Orthodox Church, and so on. And all the other statements, the fact that he's claiming that the Ukraine is run by neo-Nazis and degenerates is just silly stuff. In particular, since today's president of the Ukraine is actually Jewish, so that makes it, on top of everything, also offensive. But what has happened is he's telling his fellow Russians, hey, Ukraine is just like Russia. So the fellow Russians are going, okay, then let's see what happens with the Ukraine. Now the Ukrainians are saying, we want to be part of the West. And I don't mean the US. They're not members of NATO either. We want to be part of the West culturally, politically, socially. We want to be part of Europe, for better or for worse, okay? We do not want to be part of the East. The East stands for autocracy, and last century we want to be part of the West, with everything that comes with that. It's not just politics, it's music, it's healthcare, it's other aspects, okay? And now what's happened to Putin is fellow Russians on the street in Moscow and St. Petersburg who are demonstrating right now are looking at it and saying, okay, well, if they can get freedom in the Ukraine, freedom meaning part of an open society in the West, then we should be able to also. Now, Putin's faced with a situation where he can't allow for that. In other words, the Ukrainians can't be allowed to choose that destiny, because the next step is that young Russians, and we're not talking Russians who grew up in the communist days, in the days of the Soviet Union. We're talking about Russians in their 20s, in their 30s. They were born after the end of the Cold War. They couldn't care less about what happened pre-1990. They want lifestyle. They want the same thing you and I want. They want safety, they want security, they want financial security, right? They want the exact same things. They want to be vaccinated. They want to have the authorities tell them the truth about a pandemic. Things that we are critical about rightly in our country, we still have worlds of difference between us and Russia. And anyone who forgets that is a fool. Same thing between us and China. And so Putin is worried that this war in the Ukraine is happening not for American consumption or for European consumption. It's happening for his domestic consumption. He's reminding young people in Russia, this is what's going to happen if you demonstrate and ever think you're going to change who's in power in Russia. And that's necessary to understand, to even begin to get a clue about what's happening in the Ukraine.
Yeah, but Solinsky was doing the correct wording. He was going on TV. He was trying to negotiate with anybody he could get his hands on, basically. Why didn't Biden and a bunch of these other states in NATO say, you know, they didn't want Ukraine in the NATO anyway? They've been saying that for years. Why didn't they just go out and give Russia what they wanted? Even Solinsky was saying that, basically, you know, between the lines. Why didn't they do that? And then if Putin attacks Ukraine, then he looks like the jerk.
Giving Russia what they want, meaning what? That they'll stay neutral? Or what do you mean with giving them what they want? I don't understand.
Well, I was told that Solinsky was going out in the media, obviously was trying to make peace with Putin, anybody could get his hands on, and he was saying between the lines that there's many countries that don't want Ukraine in NATO. They just don't
the Ukraine
go right
and
out
NATO
and
is the reason NATO, other NATO countries, including US, didn't want to consider Ukrainian NATO applications, but they know full well that would be one step too far for Russia, in the sense that would be an act of war for Russia. So Ukraine, it's one thing to live with a delicate balance where the Ukraine says they're unaffiliated, which is, by the way, what President Zelensky has just a few minutes ago put on, which is, we're going to stay neutral, not part of the West, not part of the East, stay neutral. Maybe Russia can live with that. Don't forget something. The way you're framing the question is very much how Putin's kicking everyone's butt. And I don't frame it that way. For me, this becomes Putin Afghanistan. This is an unaffordable conflict. Russia's going to suffer greatly for that. We can talk about sanctions and consequences, it's a separate discussion, but this is an auto goal. I know that we love this narrative, and the Trump people love this narrative, how smart Putin is outwitting everybody, and how Biden's seen out. That's a silly narrative. You can be critical of Biden. There's plenty of room to be critical. I'm plenty critical, right? And maybe he is too old for the job. That's legitimate. but it has nothing to do with that. Russia is in the Stone Age. You have two cities in Russia that function. That's Moscow and St. Petersburg. You got large cities, don't have sewage and don't have electricity. Let's not talk about Russia as some miracle thing. This isn't China, which has brought 1 billion people out of poverty. Russia is a different situation. When was the last time you bought any product that said made in Russia? The only thing that they export is gas.
Right.
Okay, so let's just stop. Let's stop with this idea that Putin's some evil genius here. This is silly. This is a huge autogol. Ukraine is emotional, and I think the decision not to admit the Ukraine in NATO is the correct decision, because that bluff was called in Georgia and Mongolia. I'll tell you a little secret. Many years ago, I was asked by the president of Mongolia about helping him become a NATO member. And Mongolia is entirely surrounded by Russia and China. And my answer to him was, listen, I think you're making a mistake. If you're going to be a NATO member, then what's going to happen is Russia and China are going to treat that as an act of war, because now you have NATO troops at their border. And what's going to happen is they will invade you. And then you're going to find out that NATO troops will actually not come and defend you, because Mongolia is not at the national security interest of the US or any other NATO member. So what you should do instead of asking for NATO membership, is ask for NATO partnership. It's some loose friendship agreement, but it's not going to be threatening to Russia or China. And that's what happened. And we went through that. And as a result, the whole thing ended up being peaceful. Okay. So what I'm telling you is there comes a moment where it's not about being right. Of course, Mongolia gets to choose its own fate. So does Ukraine. But sometimes you also have to be smart, and you have to know what neighborhood you live in. And so if you're going to live in the neighborhood of Eastern Europe with Russia, you have to understand what line you don't want to cross. You don't want to cross NATO membership. You can have neutral agreements with NATO, with other NATO countries and so on, but you don't want to cross that line. And being wise about these things is important. The history of Eastern Europe is complicated. You know, Poland constantly was occupied and changed and partitioned, as the Ukraine had changed. So it's, when people start talking about history, it's very hard. Where do you start with history? It's like with the Middle East. These borders, it's not like they existed 5,000 years ago. And one other thing, Rob, the US has a Monroe Doctrine. It's had it for 200 years. And the Monroe Doctrine basically says, don't screw with us within 1,000 miles of our border. You do that, I don't care if you're a little tiny island like Panama or Grenada, we're going to send all our forces. And don't forget that the US military is larger than the Russian and the Chinese combined. Okay? So let's just keep some sense of proportion. Monroe Doctrine is basically our national security interest is within 1,000 miles of our border. Outside of that, we'll see what happens. We had the Iraq War, we had other conflicts. Yeah. But do not screw with the US within 1,000 miles. That's the Monroe Doctrine. And this conflict is not within 1,000 miles. This is not the US national security interest. This is also up to Europeans to decide, what do you want it to be with Russia? What kind of measures are you going to take? Germany is completely intertwined with Russia. Former German politicians like the Prime Minister of the Social Democrats, Schröder, is on the board of Nord Stream, the gas pipeline, right? There's so much intertwined interest there, where the US looks at Europe and says, hey, we saved Europe in the Second World War, okay? We've been vilified for doing that. We've had good presidents, bad presidents. It's not always been a love affair. I get that. But it's time you guys figure it out. This conflict with Ukraine is not about the US. And I think in that respect, and I was very critical of President Biden on the Afghanistan pullout, on how it happened. I don't think you could have done that worse, even if you decide to pull out. There's plenty of room to be critical. I don't like Secretary of State or National Security Advisor that with their statements on Russia. I think they're like little snacks for their Russian counterparts. It's like boys playing with men. There's plenty of room to be critical, but this was not the US fault, and it's not up to the US to solve this. It's not a NATO problem. NATO wisely stayed out of the Ukraine. And we have to remember that there are measures you can take to hurt Russia. You can do that. You have to decide whom you're hurting and whether they're sustainable. We can talk about it. Sanctions, SWIFT, there are a lot of things you can do. How does it really hurt? Cyber war. But the Ukraine issue shouldn't be solved through NATO.
Yeah, but didn't Russia just do something with their currency? So they're pretty good for a year, correct?
No, they're toast. Here's the deal. How deep do you want to answer this question, Rob? You really want to peel away the onion? We'll go deep. Okay. If we just say, hey, do they have enough foreign currency reserves to sit it out like in a bunker for a while? They can handle sanctions. Already the rich guys already have all the money abroad. Yeah, but that's silly. You don't need to get me on for that. That's just kind of the stuff you read any newspaper. It's the same stuff. You have a bazillion pundits who go on TV and repeat each other, right? That's just silly conventional nonsense. Here, let me give you some scenarios, okay?
Sure.
Sanctions really hurt. Now, if you keep, let's take an example. Let's say you say we block all Russian financial institutions from the dollar market and SWIFT, meaning the interbank payment system. Okay, you're really going to screw them. But you know what's also going to happen? Russia and China, which has also been blocked to some extent out of SWIFT, not as a country, but certain institutions because of their work in Iran. What's going to happen is they're going to accelerate the development of an alternative interbank payment system. So that may hurt them today, but 5 years down the road, you're going to lose everything because SWIFT won't be the dominant payment system. So when you make sanctions, you have to understand the consequences. Here's what's happened in Russia. Russia has definitely been hurt by financial sanctions, but you know what's also happened? Let me give you another example. You take Libya, the fall of Gaddafi, 200 billion leave the country in cash. They're put in warehouses anywhere from the Ivory Coast to Jakarta, Indonesia. Okay, Western financial institutions fly into those places, take containers full of cash. Each one has about $25 million in cash. Containers full of them, fly them to their capitals. I know this for a fact. Into their vaults, take 35% profit margin, put 65% into the SWIFT system, and keep 35% for themselves. Now, what do they do with all that cash? You can ask yourself, oh, well, that's easy. Now, Russia has become a cash economy. You want to buy an apartment in Moscow, you better show up with dollars in cash. Why? Because as a result of the sanctions, they can't do it with an interbank market. So now your sanctions have actually accelerated a dependence on a US dollar cash. So when you talk about sanctions, yeah, they can sit it out. It definitely does hurt them. But where it really hurts them, it hurts their lifestyle. So you got these 20 richest, wealthiest, most powerful Russians. They can't just suddenly go and travel all over the world. They can't enjoy the same luxuries they have. They're sort of not really admitted into polite society. That's where the sanctions really hurt. You can embarrass them. You can disclose their secret accounts that they have in Panama or a JP Morgan Chase or a Deutsche Bank or wherever. You can really embarrass it and create a political backlash in Russia, which is what Alexander Navalny, the opposition leader, tried to do, which is why he's in prison. He was first poisoned, right? But when you talk about sanctions, first of all, understand if they're effective. They are effective, but what you're doing is you're accelerating their own tools, right? In other words, if you keep someone out of financial system long enough, right? So as if I say to you, I'm going to keep you out of the internet. Well, then you're eventually going to develop your own internet, right? That's what's happening there. So it does hurt them, but sanctions alone are not going to be effective because the ones you're trying to punish are the ones who are independently wealthy and have independent resources.
We also have a mainstream media that's trying to push for war. I mean, some of them sound like just like they did when they were pushing for war in Iraq and Afghanistan right now. And it seemed like, and I got to give Biden credit for this, when he first came out and did a press conference a couple days back, he seemed very level and minded. And then I don't know what happened with one of the advisors, but they started pushing like how to talk against Russia. And then all of a sudden, that's when they started to move forward as far as Russia moving forward into Ukraine. So it does seem that Biden doesn't really want this war issue. He's trying to calm everything down. And then we have these people in the media that are pushed into the administration. It's like a revolving door where we have these media pundits. They go into the administration, they have friends in the administration, and they tell them and leak stuff. And that's a lot of problems that go on as far as society in America, where we have these people that do this.
We do. But you know, Rob, when you look at the media, or even if you look at the military industrial complex, right? So
Correct.
Companies that manufacture weapon systems, which of course benefit from wars.
Right.
So that's not complicated. When you look at that, it's like that old saying, you don't get mad at a shark for trying to eat you, because that's simply what a shark does. So you don't get mad at the media for pushing narratives, because in the end, dramatic stories, just like negative stories, is what sells media, sells newspapers, sells advertisement revenues, gets you more clicks, right? That's why negative and crazy stories do a lot better than positive stories. But so media is simply media. A government needs to have the internal strength and the internal compass to figure out what the right policies are, irrespective of the media. And if the media doesn't like it, they can go kick rocks. That's as far as I'm concerned. If you're elected president of the United States, or U.S. senator, or U.S. congressman, or whatever, congressperson, your job is not to please the media. I know that you need media to get reelected, but you have to, at some point, if you're president of the United States, you are at the mountaintop. You don't have to please anyone. You do what's right at that moment. Yeah, you have to be able to do policies that Congress is not going to shoot down. You have to know how to build coalitions, but you're not doing this through the media. But what is really shameful, and this I do find a new thing entirely, that we have part of, in fact, almost mainstream media now on the right that is literally siding with Putin, if you want. In other words, to have something that we did have a consensus on throughout the Cold War and throughout the last 30 years, which is we have geopolitical allies and we have geopolitical enemies. That doesn't mean you don't talk with your enemies. Doesn't mean you don't negotiate. You do. Those are the ones you need to negotiate with. You don't need to negotiate with your friends. That's like when Israelis say we're not talking to Palestinians. I'm like, well, who do you want to talk to? Only your mom and dad? I mean, obviously, same for the Palestinians. You have to negotiate with your enemies. So I do believe in that, and you know how strongly I believe in that, and I work on that. That's my daily job, is to negotiate behind the scenes. But we never were unclear about where we stood and where someone else stood. It's not like when the Soviet Union was in Afghanistan that the US was unclear about where they were in that conflict. We supplied the Mujahideen with Stinger rockets, which of course later came to bite us with Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. But we were clear on those conflicts. We were clear throughout the last 100 years on where we stood. And now I'm seeing something in the US that I find really quite dangerous, which is we hate our own more than we are united against an outside threat. Forget right or left for a moment. That's something that's going to destroy us. So when Putin says the US is weak, that's what he means. He means that we know, in other words, people hate their uncle at the if you have a, if you're liberal and you have a Trump uncle, a Trump loving uncle at Thanksgiving, you're going to hate this person more than you're going to be united in terms of what we all agreed was an outside threat. And that's a new thing, because that means we can't deal with vaccines normally, pandemic normally, tax normally, Supreme Court confirmation normally. In other words, we don't function anymore. And so if you really do have enemies, and Russia is perceived as an enemy, right, and for a lot of good reasons, what they're now saying is, hey, we don't have to fight you guys anymore. You're going to do this all by yourself. And that's not a new thing, which is all the great empires in history were never defeated from an outside enemy. They all were defeated from within. That's when people on the inside started to fight. Whether it's Rome, ancient Greece, it doesn't matter for what. All the great enemies, because I don't count Nazi Germany as a great empire. All the great empires that lasted for decades or centuries, they were all defeated from within. And that's something that the US has to take a hard look. Do you really hate your fellow American just because you disagree politically or culturally? Do you hate him really so much that you're willing to embrace an enemy of the US who actually wishes to destroy the US? You're going to embrace that person just for the sake of weakening. So you're really going to attack Biden over the Ukraine? Do you really think Biden did something wrong with the Ukraine? I think he mishandled some situations. But do you think this is really, what do you want him to do? Send American troops to the Ukraine? Obviously not. Obviously, we're not sending them. What are you going to tell an American father or mother whose son or daughter died defending the Ukrainians? How is that American national security interest, right? So you can't go after Biden for something like that. But you also, I don't understand this embrace of Putin by certain people in American political culture. I really, actually, it's where you really start to lose me. It really means that you care so much more about only your own tribal instinct and hate your own fellow Americans so much that you can't even see this anymore. And that's where I think we have to be careful, because that's where really our enemies do win when we reach that point.
I do want to get into these last few questions as we end. We've heard a lot of things as with this Russia conflict, but the things I keep hearing, and this was what kind of makes me nervous. We already knew there was a tense relationship throughout the Obama administration and now in with Biden as far as the Saudi relationship. It seems like now Saudi is playing nice with Russia because of their dislike for Biden. We see that the oil prices are going up, the gas prices are up. Are you worried about this alliance right now between Saudi Arabia, Russia, and China?
So Saudi Arabia is really complex. It would take us a long time to unpack it. I'll just give you a few bullet points. The US and Saudi Arabia have had a complicated relationship for, let's say, 100 years. Where the idea was basically Saudi Arabia produces so much of the world's oil. It's very cheap oil, meaning it's very easy. It's $5 a barrel to pump out of the ground versus $50, $60 a barrel in other places. So it means they make money when oil price goes above $5 a barrel. Actually, it's less than five. It's sweet crude, it's cheap to refine, and so on. They had the jackpot as far as oil is concerned. So for centuries, for decades, we've had to deal with the Saudis, which is, hey, we buy your oil, we protect you, right? We give you military protection, but in return, you agree to price all the dollar trades in US dollars. That's how one of the reasons the dollar became a global reserve currency. That balance worked for a long time. Then a few things started to change it. A very unstable transition in Saudi Arabia, in particular recently with Mohammed bin Salman sort of taking on all the power and changing their narrative. The Iranian conflict, Saudis watching the US not protecting under the Trump administration, not coming to the Saudi defense when the Iranians fired some missiles against Saudi oil installations. So they started to say to themselves, hey, we may need to look for other protectors because we don't know that the US is as committed to the region as it used to be, which is, by the way, something Israel would do well to figure out too. Not to just assume the US is always going to be with Israel just because it hasn't always been. You only have to go back to the Suez crisis in the 50s, in the 1950s to know that. And so the Saudis are starting to recalibrate it. Now, the Saudis' biggest issue is not whether they're with Russia or China, because they know full well that neither Russia nor China are going to protect them militarily. They're just not. Russia doesn't do that, and China certainly doesn't do it. China really only deals in its own self-interest militarily in the South China Sea and the Pacific. The only one that would do that is the US. But what they are saying is, we need to deal with Iran. Iran is 90 million nuclear power. How do we contain Iran? Because that goes back to the Saudi being predominantly Sunni Islam and Iran being Shia Islam. And I can tell you from Saudi friends who have told me, hey, Daniel, I know you're Jewish. I want to tell you something. Your Jewish son could come and marry my Muslim daughter because at least you're not a Shia. They hate each other, again, a lot more than they dislike Jews or Christians, right? So what I'm telling you is this kind of hatred and dislike goes way deeper than whether you like the US or China or Russia. So the Saudis are going through an identity crisis. They're the dominant country in the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf. But the United Arab Emirates is emerging, what General Mattis called Little Sparta, as the reliable military ally, together with a military base in Qatar, right? The US military base. So Saudis are trying to figure all that as they're modernizing their country. Now, how do you modernize? All the technologies they're looking for, future green energies, they're all originating from the US. Yes, the Chinese can build solar panels for them, but the core, the microprocessors, everything that they need, for NEOM, for their futuristic green city, for example, that only works with Western and US partnerships. So it's a bluff to think that the Saudis actually have an option of totally committing into the same bed as Russia and China. But economically, of course, they will try to diversify. Now, what does Russia have to offer the Saudis that they need? They don't need Russian oil. They obviously have enough oil. What else does? Only weapons. But the Saudi weapon systems, from airplanes to weapon systems, are all US sourced. You can't have F-15, F-16s, F-14 Tomcats for decades and decades and suddenly shift. Even a regular airline that has Boeings can't just one day say, to hell with Boeing, we're going full Airbus. That's a complicated transition. For a military to just say, we've been for 60, 70 years US ally, and with small exceptions where they were getting French planes like Mirage planes in the 60s and 70s last century, mostly we're talking US weapon systems. You don't just shift that. So the Russians don't really have anything to offer them, right? Other than some geopolitical alternative. What do the Chinese have to offer them? Infrastructure development. Now, they don't need Chinese money. The Saudis have enough money. The Chinese do buy Saudi oil, but Saudis don't have a problem selling their oil anywhere. It's not like they're sanctioned for it. So when you start to think about it, really, the US has a strong card, but the US has to decide if we want to have that alliance, we have to commit to the security of that region. And in the US, you saw this already. You've seen this for a while. It happened in the Obama years, right? After the Iraq war, what you saw is pulling back, saying, we're not going to engage anymore and fight other people's battles, right? Not in Afghanistan, not in Iraq. So you're seeing US pull back already under Obama, definitely under Trump, who pulled out our troops out of Syria and totally screwed the Kurds, who are our only allies there. And you see it now with Biden also. You saw with that terrible retreat out of Afghanistan and the way it was done. right? I'm not talking whether it was done and the way it was done, right? I mean, you couldn't do it worse if you tried, in terms of leaving equipment behind and so on, and leaving friends and allies behind and translators behind. And now the Saudis are saying, are you guys reliable? Are you still committed to the region? The same thing that some Israelis are starting to ask. Are you in fact reliable? So if the Iranians fire rockets on us, Israel, or Hezbollah does, or the Houthis in Yemen do, what is the US actually going to do? Because if you're saying Monroe Doctrine, we're not within 1,000 miles, can we really trust you? And so when you ask the question about the Saudis, that's the question. The Saudis want to know whether the US is still a reliable ally.
Yeah, but shouldn't the US still be in there? Because, not only Israel, but you have to worry about India and Pakistan and those two nuclear powers, and they don't like each other that much. And that could be some serious issues. There's a lot still in that region. What happened with Afghanistan, how it could create a new ISIS, new Al Qaeda. I mean, there's a lot there still, correct?
There is, but when you ask the question, you have to also look at the US realistically in terms of its political system. You said earlier there are no great leaders anymore. The problem is not that like the DNA of human beings just got worse. The problem is we have a complicated political system that has problems which are metastasizing. They're creating a polarization of our political leadership. When you have polarized two parties with polarized candidates, you're going to get crappy candidates. You're going to get loud candidates who only appeal to their base because the real elections are primaries. The real elections are not the general elections, meaning you don't have to justify reasonable positions. You can just scream at either side of the political spectrum, right? You don't have to build a consensus. So at the end, over a few decades, you end up having low quality leaders because you don't have a crop. Anyone who has talent saying, I'm not going to do that. I have alternatives. I can go into tech. I can go into finance. I can be an entrepreneur. Why am I going to, I'm going to spend my life in Congress to maybe one day run for office? I'm not going to do that for president. And so we have a system, and what we need in the US is start also to look at our political system to see, because if you say, what should the US do? I'm going to throw right back at you. Well, who's the one doing? The president can't just decide to deal with a conflict in Saudi Arabia. It's a matter of, do I declare war? Is that a congressional power or presidential power? Well, Congress is hopeless. Congress is not going to divide. Whoever's in the White House, the other party in Congress is going to block it, whether it's a Supreme Court nominee or a military conflict. That goes back to what I said earlier. If we hate each other more than we recognize our outside threats and are united, right? If we hate each other so much, we can't deal with it. We can't have a coherent geopolitical policy, because if Biden's going to say we're going to have a military presence in the region because it's important to our allies or it's important for our national security for whatever reason, then the Republicans are going to say, absolutely not. There you go again, spending our tax dollars abroad. If Trump does that, the Democrats are going to say that. In other words, all you want to do is take down the guy that you don't agree with. That's not, so our allies and our enemies are paying close attention. And look, I was born in the early 60s. So I grew up watching the US still being perceived as the savior of the world from the Second World War. That started to change with Vietnam. That definitely changed with the Iraq War. Yeah. But I still go in that generation. I was born only 18 years after the end of World War II. So the identity of being grateful to the US, even if some people had a complex and the French had their issues and the German had their issues, but there was still that sense that the US is responsible for the post-world order and for peace, right? For better or for worse, a conversation for another day. That's no longer the case now. Now the US is looked at as a superpower, but as a sick superpower, as a superpower that's going against itself, as a virus that's eating up the US from the inside. And if we don't deal with it, then what's going to happen, whether it's Saudi Arabia or the Ukraine or Israel or India, Pakistan in that conflict, or Taiwan or Japan or Britain, they're going to start saying, you're not reliable. We can't trust you to be there. We do need to look at alternatives. What's the alternative superpower? Right now, that's China. That's not Russia. Russia is a nuclear power. It's not in any other respect a superpower. It just isn't. Russia's GDP is smaller than Spain's.
They already started saying that under Trump. You're not reliable. We can't trust you after they pulled out of the Iran deal. Now
right.
Biden's trying to go in, and now it's extremely complicated.
And what's going to happen
with
that? Which is if he tries to get back into the deal, and that's a chat for another time. What if he does that? What's going to happen? Republicans in Congress are just going to shut that deal down. If Trump were going into that deal, Democrats in Congress would shut it. You know, it just, and I'm not trying to create an equivalence. I have a preference for one side to the other, but in order, in the spirit of what I'm saying, we have to look at it as an equivalent, which is we've got to stop. So, for example, Trump correctly, I dislike almost everything about Donald Trump, but he correctly identified the virus as having originated in China. Do I like the way he said it, calling it the China virus or the Kung flu that he liked to say, stuff like that? No, it's kind of a little playgroundy. That's Trump. But he said it correctly. And he said, I don't know that it originated from a wet market. What if it did escape from a lab? And the left went nuts. Right. MSNBC went nuts. It's, again, the race thing, because everything is coined in race. You're, again, going against Chinese American, went nuts. When, in fact, he was right. Yeah. He was right. Did he handle the pandemic right? No. Did he go after Fauci? Yeah. Should he have? No. There's plenty to criticize. But if I've lost the ability to look at that and say, no, Trump was right. He was right on that. I don't have to like the way he speaks, but he was right. And if I lost that ability, then our country doesn't work, because we have a two-party system. So it's zero sum. You're either with the guy in power or you hate the guy in power. It doesn't work. We've got to find a way where we can look at people in a nuanced way. I can look at Biden and say, I like certain things and I really don't like other things. I also, by the way, believe nothing about Biden screams presidential. Never did. If it hadn't been for 4 years of Trump, there's no way Joe Biden is president. There's just no way. But you can say if it hadn't been for 8 years of George W. Bush, you probably don't get Barack Obama. You just don't. So, you know, put it in context. Put these things. And if you don't have 8 years of Barack Obama, you probably don't get Donald Trump. We're a complicated country that way. But we now got to a point where if we can't unite, where we can't look at something aside from the politics, who's in favor, just anything. A virus, a vaccine, anything. If we can't look at it that way, we're doomed as a country, and our problems are a whole lot bigger than the Ukraine then.
Should have been well, Trump in a way ruined that, because he should have had the people try to unite behind him. He could have said, you know, we're going to go through this together. We're going to fight this virus, blah, blah, blah. He handled it the wrong way. I agree with you. And I think a different leader would have been able to capitalize that. And I think he would have really won re-election.
There's plenty to criticize. My only point there is, at least what amazes me is when he says this is a China originated virus.
Correct.
That MSNBC spends weeks and months calling him a racist for that. And to me, that's just become silly, right? In other words, you're just going to be against anything this guy says and in favor of everything that this guy's against, right? And then at some point, I'm not interested. And by the way, then that's why I don't watch that type of media. I don't watch Fox and I don't watch MSNBC. I have no interest, none.
Yeah, it's garbage. It's total garbage.
It doesn't inform my opinion. It doesn't give me information. It's just playing games to their own crowd. I don't need to do that. I get my information elsewhere. I try to source it correctly. I read media from all over the world to get as many different opinions as I can. That's the only way to do it.
Daniel Levin, DanielLevinAuthor.com. Thanks so much for your time. Really always going in depth on these subjects.
My pleasure, Rob. My pleasure.